Hello and welcome to the Sports Pro podcast. Now, before we start the show, I just wanted to give you a little nudge to talk about our sister podcast. That is Streamtime Sports. It features my colleague Chris Stone and Sports Pro CEO Nick Meacham, and it's published weekly, covering all of the latest news and developments in the sports media space, with a special focus on the people, businesses and technologies driving the sports streaming revolution. It comes out every Wednesday and is the go-to place for broadcast professionals. That's Streamtime Sports wherever you get your podcasts. All right, you guys ready? Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the Sports Pro podcast. I am your host for this week's episode, as ever, Tom Bassam. I've got a couple of esteemed colleagues with me in the studio. Hello, Sam Carp.
Hey Tom, how you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. Hello, Ed Dixon, my esteemed colleague.
Hi Tom, thanks for having me.
You're welcome, mate. You are very, very welcome. It's less hot in here this week, which is nice. I'll give you regular updates on the temperature of the Sports Pro podcast recording studio, listeners. Don't worry about that. Right, guys, this week on the agenda, we're going to talk about the Champions League. Why? Well, the Champions League starts next Tuesday, which is in, 4 or 5 days' time after this comes out. My maths is bad, especially when it comes to days. But it's an exciting Champions League, not just because, the best teams play each other and that, but because there's a new format. This has been described as the Swiss system. I don't know how accurate that is as a thing. I think people who play chess might have a bit of an issue with that. But essentially, I think that's probably what most people know it by. So we'll go with that. It's a league. Teams play each other, not home and away, which is a change from the previous format. There are no groups anymore. There's one big table. Maybe just before we kind of get too deep into it, are you excited by this new format, Ed Dixon?
Yeah, this is kind of the Swiss system light, isn't it? I mean, I can only get so excited about the Champions League group stages, to be honest.
Anything.
Yeah, that could apply to anything with you,
yeah,
to be fair.
That's true. Always aiming up. I think at worst it's going to be as forgettable as the Champions League group stages, which by and large, I think, unless you're a follower of one of those teams, I think the casuals are only so sort of emotionally invested in them. But I mean, on paper, I think it has scope. I mean, it's a sort of a Swiss League light, if you like, where we're going to have more of the sort of tier one teams, if you like, playing each other, which I guess for viewers is a good thing. The top 8 qualify, and then those who finished 9th to 24th are going to face a 2-legged playoff to progress. So it basically means if you're a club that feels you have a divine right to play in the Champions League and you still can't qualify out of the league stage into the knockout stages, then maybe that divine right is perhaps a bit questionable. But I think probably in terms of putting my own huge excitement, as you can tell in the tone of my voice aside, the number of matches in the new format means it's going to increase from, I think it's 125 to 189. And it's essentially more football. I mean, UEFA President Alexander Ceferin, he's gone on record saying the football calendar is too full. He's not really helping things, is he? This format change is partly to appease the bigger clubs who, as I mentioned, feel they should always be at European football's top table. But I think it's, aside from the enjoyment or lack of that this new format may bring, I think it throws up a lot of other questions in terms of the wider state of European football, in terms of things like player workload, keeping dissatisfied big clubs at bay and things like that.
You've given answers to many questions there, Ed, but that's fine. We can come back to some of those points later on. Sam, from your perspective, the sell on this is, as Ed said, more of the big clubs playing each other in early stages, more matches for fans. We've seen UEFA once really try and go away from a group stage format when it went with 2 group stage formats, which was a real success because that lasted about 4 years, I think. Do you think this will last? Do you think we're still going to be talking about Swiss League tables in 4 years' time?
They're not even convinced, are they? Because the fact that it's kind of like a trial period for this next cycle suggests that there's room for it to change. So it does feel very experimental. And I think like what's been quite interesting is that there's been like a lot of investment in explainer content around this revamp. Like one of the videos UEFA released ahead of the draw, I think it was like quite a star-studded video clip of like Luis Figo, Gianluigi Buffon, Robbie Keane. Not really sure how he got on there.
Inter Milan legend.
And then you had UEFA president Alexander Sheffield kind of playing this James Bond style role where he rocked up right at the end to put everyone's concerns at ease. And him and Zlatan Ibrahimovic, I think, had this drawn out conversation on the stage in front of an orchestra, which then started playing the Champions League theme tune, and everything seemed to be all right. And the kind of like, all they were talking about was that, yeah, this is going to be the best of the best, you know, the pinnacle of European football, which is what the Champions League was before anyway. Nothing's really changed in that regard, which is probably the message they were trying to get across. In terms of whether it's going to last, it's hard to say until we've seen this first edition, to be honest. Like, as you say, there's more games between the bigger teams, but it also means there's more games between lesser teams as well. I think there's been some like modelling done in terms of how many points are going to be needed for a team to qualify, and it's like quite feasible that after the first half of the league phase games, some of those top sides could have already guaranteed at least a playoff place, so they're going to be less incentivized to put out strong teams perhaps later on in that league phase. And the fact that they are going to have those games against those lower sides who have been included because of the expansion suggests that they won't have that much trouble accumulating points. So yeah, whether it lasts is kind of, we'll have to see how the reception is, but I think the main thing that's going to dictate whether it lasts is whether it makes any money. Like that's why it's been revamped. It's been revamped to generate more interest in the league phase, only among fans but also among commercial partners, broadcasters as well. So I think that will ultimately dictate whether it goes beyond this cycle or not.
The money side of it will obviously, I think that you're right, it's always going to play a factor. I think if it is a total disaster and people don't understand it, and as you said, we get to a point where we've got teams basically worked out the maths and figured out that, okay, we just need to do this and then we can play basically reserve teams for the remaining games, UEFA will probably look at that and go, well, even if we generate more money, that can't be considered a success. The funny thing about this as well, on your original point about this still being the best of the best, it's actually more of the best. So that slightly makes it less of the best because, as you said, you've got some less good teams in because you've expanded the whole competition. But what it does mean, yeah, as Ed said, brings up the number of games, which automatically brings up the amount of TV revenue that comes in, because really you're just asking broadcasters you're selling them more things. So it's sort of quite natural. I think basically in terms of whether or not this is perceived as success will largely rest in the first maybe 2 seasons, I think. What do you think, Ed, would be considered a success
from this first year?
From this initial from this period, I guess.
I should probably mention that all Football Manager players are very clued up on this new league format because it's been in the game for a couple of years. So having led Southampton to back-to-back Champions Leagues, I'm well versed in the league format, which probably means makes me more informed about whether it's going to be a success or not, obviously.
Such is life. Football Manager is life.
Yeah, reality and fiction are sort of blurring slightly with Football Manager. But no, I guess success in the first year is probably more broadly speaking, is probably stopping the external noises, which is complaints from certain teams about, the amount of revenue they're getting from the Champions League, the amount, things like more matches and stuff like that should help appease that. But also murmurings around, the Super League, which is just kind of like sort of the Black Knight in Monty Python, saying, "'Tis but a scratch, I'm still here, I'm still fine." So that would be another one. But also, I think it's becoming more difficult as well. And I sort of mentioned it earlier with just the way the calendar is sort of just getting bigger for players. There's this legal case involving FIFA and FIFA Pro. You've got the likes of Richard Masters, Seferin, as I mentioned, mentioning the size of the calendar. So I think some things, I just think inevitably are going to have to fall by the wayside. Some things are going to have to be cut. And I don't think it's going to be the Champions League just because of the appeal it holds within the wider calendar.
So is this you saying the success of this new Champions League group stage is whether or not the League Cup exists in 3 years' time?
Absolutely. No, I would say the success essentially is going to be based on, I think it's here to stay. I think UEFA they're not really going to backtrack on a format like this, because if they do, they're going to have to cut the number of teams. So the only way they would do it is then revert back to the group stages when you're probably going to have the same amount of teams anyway and the same amount of games. So I think the success is probably going to be based around appeasing those big clubs that are still unsatisfied about certain things about the Champions League. Yeah, and just I think onboarding fans for this new kind of format. But, I think when the Nations League launched, people were sort of a bit ambivalent towards it. I think particularly the format as well, I think was far more complicated than what this is. But in the end, it kind of bedded in quite well. And now it's given a lot more kind of I guess, heft to friendlies, to non-qualification and tournament matches. So obviously this is slightly different, but I think fans are generally willing to give it a go. In theory, I don't think it's going to make anything worse, but I think we won't get a better idea until kick-off, really.
True. I think your point about UEFA launching relatively successful things in recent times is pertinent. The Nations League, I think, is a success. People are more interested in those than they were in friendlies. The Conference League has undoubtedly, I think, been a success. I wouldn't say this, but I think probably certain people would think that the expanded Euros is a success. Like, it brings in more money, more teams are more nations and federations are happy because they get to enter the tournament. Scotland get to be at a tournament. Great for them.
It's less interesting though. It's kind of something that it has created those less interesting games. But yeah, I don't know. It's like success in like the first couple of years. It's going to be as long as it generate some of those like vanity metrics that they're going to be able to put out on press releases that point to that kind of success, because ultimately with this now they occupy more of the calendar. There's going to be certain weeks where there's Champions League games on a Tuesday, Wednesday and a Thursday. There's going to be more frequency of Champions League games. They're in the minds of people more often, and it's kind of a habitual thing, isn't it? Like on a Tuesday or Wednesday night, if there's a Champions League game on, then usually you're going to flick it on. If it's like, I don't know, it's quite a like thing here in the UK. If you've got like a five-a-side game on a Wednesday, you go to the pub after and you watch the Champions League game there. I think they are just occupying more of that space, and naturally all of those sort of figures are going to go up, and they'll probably, that's not the only thing that they'll measure the success on, but that's what they'll sort of talk outwardly about, as well as those kind of like revenue figures that I mentioned before. And it's not, I don't think it's necessarily just because you're increasing the number of games means that commercial partners are automatically going to want to pay more for it. Look at the Premier League, when they went out with package of rights, they offered more games and they got the exact same flat figure that they did pretty much from the previous cycle.
Per game went down. I think the overall figure went up.
Yeah.
So your point, yeah, exactly. It's that kind of like cost benefit analysis.
Yeah, exactly. And I think kind of the bigger thing is kind of for commercial partners is wanting to just still be associated with that Champions League brand. Like that doesn't change. Like that still is the pinnacle, as they've kind of been trying to talk about. And I think that's what's just going to make this be fine ultimately. Like I don't know how much you can do with that group phase, because I think like there's a bigger problem that exists in European football, in that there is now a pool of like 8 teams basically who are so much more stronger than the rest because they are financially so much stronger than everyone else, which means irrespective of what you do with that group stage, when there are more teams involved, it is only going to get interesting really towards that later stage, because that's when it really levels out and there's sort of 8, sort of maybe even less than 8, maybe like 4 or 5 heavy hitters come up against each other, and it actually becomes kind of like a fairer competition.
Yeah, that's all true. I guess the other thing to mention on this is in terms of like whether or not this is a success, and Ed, you kind of hinted at it, is whether or not in 4 years' time we're still talking about Super League and we're talking about FIFA, or like FIFA's club competition. So we've got the Club World Cup, which is allegedly launching next summer, although there's very little detail known about that. And as you've written about, I think, Ed, we've got the FIFA Pro lawsuit going on currently, or the legal injunction. I can't remember exactly what the correct phrasing is here. Would you say that's maybe a metric of success here, if we're not talking about the Super League, and UEFA can still probably view itself as the organisation which puts on the most prestigious club tournament in the world?
Well, UEFA's not interested in FIFA organising more tournaments because it affects their own. But I think they're all as bad as each other, to be honest. Like, it's not often I side with FIFA or try and empathise with them. UEFA, for example, has accused FIFA of this, that and the other in terms of the Club World Cup filling out an already too rammed schedule. And FIFA has accused them of hypocrisy, and this Champions League format as an example of that. And you can kind of see their point. I think we're at a kind of tipping point for the calendar. Something has to change. I don't know how that change is going to come. I mean, domestically, you might look to scrap things like the League Cup to free up a little bit. But again, I just feel you're sort of scratching the surface, really. The real kind of nuclear option is if players actually strike. I know we've seen players in the MLB do that, but that's slightly different because that's at a league-wide level. If a player's to strike across Europe, that would be unprecedented because it would involve multiple leagues, and the player pool of footballers is so much larger in Europe than, say, just baseball in America, and indeed worldwide for football, that it could become sort of like a sort of you could be seeing players sort of come in just to sort of fill slots. I know this is an extreme.
It's an interesting way of playing it out, actually. So
it's an extreme scenario, and I'm not saying that's going to happen. But
James Ward-Prowse's scab, Ed, do you want to go there?
He should have come home. He's gone to Forest, hasn't he? Never mind.
Can you see it? Him filling in a squad, you know. Enzo Fernandez has gone on strike, but James Ward-Prowse is prepared to play in the Club World Cup.
Yeah, he's a good, honest lad. He'd get the job done. I think I'm sort of mindful of how I've sort of turned this conversation about a format for a competition into a more existential look at European football, which is without wanting to be sort of self-indulgent about things like that, about the wider state of the game. I kind of want to pull back on that. But problems facing UEFA involve external pressure from clubs, revenue, and then the likes of FIFA getting involved with their own tournaments. If this new format for the Champions League, which could help make the competition from the earliest onset feel more aligned and less disconnected that sometimes the group stages do, and there's more of a knock-on effect. So like when the expanded Euros, for example, there was some. I actually thought the group stages were brilliant. There were some fantastic games which came about from the expanded teams, the likes of Georgia. Turkey had some great games, etc., etc. It's kind of that peak tournament football. This new format may help sort of have more consequences at the wider opening stage, which in theory will help. You know, if it strengthens the Champions League brand, that benefits UEFA and gives them more of a foothold in the sort of wider European football market as these various external pressures kind of come to be. So there is a lot riding on it, I would say.
Sam, any further thoughts?
I mean, just on that like Super League point, it's no coincidence that, do you remember, like this format was kind of agreed the day of or the day after the Super League was falling apart. So it's no coincidence that this happened when it did, when it emerged, when it did. They kind of video that I mentioned before, that explainer video, they kind of loosely refer to the Super League and joke about it never happening. It does show you that it's still on their minds. They are still worried about it. They are conscious that they need to sort of be proactive in making these changes to offset that threat. So going to keep just going back to that point I made at the start, like the real thing that will determine whether this does stave off a Super League is how much money it makes. Like their budget says they're forecasting 4.52 billion euros in revenue from club competitions this year.
I think I read somewhere it's a 30% increase in media rights income.
Yeah, so 30% increase, big increase. So that's just kind of that sort of money that those big clubs in particular will be looking at as this progresses, because if this doesn't kind of make a significant difference, especially as we've sort of seen the struggles that some of those clubs who lobbied for the Super League in the first place, the struggles that those leagues have had in securing improved media rights deals, so their pot of money isn't going to increase that way. They'll be looking to tournaments like the Champions League to kind of offset that, I guess. If they're not seeing that, then maybe there will kind of be a push for a Super League again. We haven't really heard that much about it since that EU ruling at the end of last year and the launch of kind of the new format for what a Super League could look like. But yeah, maybe if this doesn't kind of generate the revenues that UEFA says it will, then that's perhaps the point when we'll see a change. And just in terms of like the FIFA Club World Cup, like, I don't know, is that even going to happen at this point? There's no broadcaster, there's no sponsors, we know nothing about it. All we know is like the dates of when it's going to take place and some of the teams, and I can't see it. I don't know, I definitely don't take FIFA's side in this. Like, I feel like at least with the Champions League, it's always been a prestigious competition. You're expanding something that has that place in the calendar already. I know the Club World Cup existed, but no one really took any notice of it, and it didn't damage the calendar too much because only however many, it was 8 teams, a handful of teams are taking part in it. So yeah, I think FIFA are the real disruptors of the calendar in that case, and you know, their duty as an international governing body is more to set the rules for the sport, ensure that those are followed, protect the players, basically, which I feel like in all this is often forgotten, that that's FIFA's role first and foremost, and they've become such a sort of commercial enterprise that I think that kind of has slipped down their list of priorities massively.
Before we move on, and actually we'll move on to another body, which is essentially an organising committee, which has become a revenue generator. That's the sort of the slide of these organisations over the last, I guess, really probably since the advent of the Champions League as a Champions League and not just a European Cup, is governing bodies becoming commercial enterprises and seeking and needing to grow their revenue in order to support the businesses, aka the clubs that make up their membership. Increasing in the last 5 to 10 years, that's become a battle between the bigger ones, and FIFA want a bigger part of that club pie because they can see that's kind of where a lot of the money is. They get a finite amount from the World Cup, they get a bit from the existing format Club World Cup, and that's pretty much it. So it's not the same as having those annual year-on-years that you get from the Champions League. And as you said, Sam, the Champions League is a heritage property almost at this point. Everyone knows the Champions League music. Everyone knows what the trophy looks like. It's got its own. It's got a very strong visual identity. It's something that people really want to win. It's something that players talk about. Whether or not we get there with the Club World Cup, I don't know. But I wouldn't be surprised if it's not quite what FIFA want it to be. Sorry to interrupt your podcast. I just wanted to give you a little nudge to check out our Sports Pro Plus Media Hub. Now, the Media Hub is packed full of features and tools to power your digital media and content strategies. It has some really interesting features such as our company profiles, media rights trackers, sector maps, and our broadcast and OTT news channel, as well as market spotlights. Now, these market spotlights are fascinating insights into some of the biggest media markets in the world, looking at the major players in that territory and the properties that matter. You can access the Media Hub with a Sports Pro Plus subscription, and right now, podcast listeners can get 10% off an annual subscription using code podcast10 at checkout. That is code podcast10 at checkout. Terms and conditions apply, and that is only available on an annual subscription. So once again, that is podcast10 at checkout. Now, I return to your regularly scheduled programming. Right, we're going to move on to another major organisation which has become a much more commercially viable and successful business, and that is the Paralympics. That wrapped up this weekend in Paris. I think it's probably going to, when it all shakes out, be the second most successful Paralympics after London 2012. London 2012 sold more tickets, but this was certainly a step back in the right direction in terms of viewership and engagement, all of that kind of stuff from Tokyo and even from Rio too. I realise it's a very busy time in the sports calendar, but gents, have you taken much in from the Paralympics? Anything caught your eye particularly?
Yeah, the thing with the Paralympics, there's a challenge for them, I think, to garner attention, because obviously the Olympics occupies a position in the calendar where it's pretty much the only sport that's on. And then when the Paralympics is starting, you also have like domestic football season starting in Europe. Obviously the last weekend coincided with the NFL this time round starting in the US. So they're kind of in that unfortunate position where they do kind of start to run up against other things getting back underway, whereas the Olympics, there's always that feel that, you know, this is the only thing that's happening in the world of sport right now. But as you say, I think like the way it was embraced in France, as you said, I think it was across the Olympics and Paralympics, there were record ticket sales, 2.5 million of 3 million tickets made available for the Paralympics were sold, which, considering they only reached the 1 million mark at the end of June, I think that's a pretty significant effort, and probably speaks to kind of the way the mood changed, I guess, in the host nation after people saw the Olympics and were kind of like, oh, let's go to the Paralympics as well, was probably a bit of a mood change. And then also just the way it's been embraced around the world and broadcast. Obviously in France itself, I think France Television's averaged around 20 million viewers per day. Here in the UK, Channel 4 said its coverage reached 18.5 million. NBC in the US were averaging 1.3 million viewers. So, and all of those were up on Tokyo. So, yeah, kind of similar trends to the Olympics, I guess, in terms of a bit of a bounce back, but also probably speaks to the way in which I think broadcasters themselves were investing more in their coverage this time around. I think sponsors also were kind of incorporating the Paralympics more into their activations, which helped boost the profile of the event that way as well. So yeah, I think you basically saw the fruits of some of that investment, and it was kind of a step back in the right direction for that event.
Yeah, just on that point, it's probably worth actually kind of taking stock in the sort of the broadcast journey the Paralympics has been on in the last 20 years. Obviously, I'm coming at this from a UK perspective, but like, you know, the BBC provided live weekend coverage. They didn't do that until Athens 2004. You know, it was only 20 years ago. And then obviously the advent of things like iPlayer meant they could elevate their coverage. Inevitably, because it held rights for the Olympics as well, it meant it did feel like the Paralympics were almost an extension of it, which goes back to Sam's point. I think what Channel 4 do deserve a lot of credit for. I mean, you know, the fact that when they took over the rights for the Paralympics, you know, it was London 2012. I mean, it's the closest you're going to get to a broadcasting open goal when you're taking on rights for the first time. But what they've done, I think they've delivered blanket coverage. They've provided a very unique platform for parasport, changing those perceptions of disability, which is one of the core aims of the Paralympics. I still very, clearly remember that, Meet the Superhumans campaign ahead of London 2012 to, Public Enemy's Harder Than You Think, which you're probably surprised that I've heard of.
I am, yeah.
Knowing my music taste. You've already quoted some of the figures, Sam. I think going forward, I believe as well, it was the first time that the live coverage of all 22 sports, wasn't there, for this year, up from the 19 at Tokyo, yeah. But yeah, Channel 4 deserves a lot of credit for sort of ending, I think, a perception that the Paralympics, from a broadcast perspective, is an extension for the host broadcaster, because obviously Channel 4 have really taken ownership of it. And I guess looking ahead to LA 2028, NBC is going to be very aware of its role in sort of continuing how it can deliver a wider cultural shift in America towards perceptions of disability and stuff like that. So I think Channel 4 deserve a lot of credit for their coverage, obviously having only watched it from a UK standpoint, and then sort of the figurative baton has now been passed to NBC. And I think with everything that their LA 2028 is promising to be, both for the Olympics and Paralympics, it could potentially sort of be another kind of milestone moment for the Olympic and Paralympic movement, I think.
Yeah, I think that you're right. Channel 4 do deserve a lot of credit, and the fact that you can still remember that marketing campaign this many years on shows that they really have. They've kind of owned it since, and I mean that they've obviously owned it in that they've had the rights since, but they've really made that a kind of core part of their brand as well. That includes using like presenters with disabilities at sort of the forefront of their coverage. I mean, I think that's probably something that the BBC would have done and had done too, but it's a lot more celebrated, not more noted on Channel 4. The only thing I do think about Channel 4's coverage, and this is where they suffer from not being the big public service broadcaster. They do get some public service funding, but they're not the public service broadcaster, is that multi-channel offering. Like, it's something that anecdotally I was having a conversation with my mum about, and she was like, I just seem less aware of that it's on. And I'm like, well, it's probably because it's not on the BBC. You consume the BBC in so many different ways, and the BBC has so many different ways of promoting and channeling you towards the things that it wants you to watch. That's its radio coverage, that's its news stuff, it's BBC iPlayer. The fact that BBC iPlayer, you can have multiple feeds. Like Channel 4 had to take some of those additional feeds to YouTube, and it's probably worked out really well for them. I've not seen the numbers on this, but I imagine that putting that stuff for free on a platform that people like to use probably brought in some big numbers, but it doesn't make you feel like Channel 4 are owning the whole thing. And maybe that's the next step in this, really, really kind of streamlining that Paralympics presentation on a mainstream broadcaster and carving out a sort of product, a bit like Discovery Plus has done with the multiple feeds that they have for the actual Olympics, and taking the coverage to that next level and putting it kind of all in one place where people can find it. And it's not like, okay, I can watch the Paralympics main feed on Channel 4, maybe a bonus feed, but then I've got to go to YouTube to get this thing if I want to watch that. That's the only thing. That's the only like very slight criticism I would have of the Paralympics coverage, and the fact that that's maybe where you suffer on the awareness. But yeah, generally, I think as you said, Sam, right at the top there, like the Olympics, this has been a bit of a bounce back for the IPC. I'm sure, Andrew Parsons, who said he was sort of waiting for the sort of last weeks of the Olympics to give them that push. I think it sounds like they got it.
I think like also just a change in the way people speak about it as well. It's something that we saw across broadcast, across the marketing campaigns. Like Ed spoke about the Channel 4 campaign there when they first got the rights, but there was an evolution of that this year, in that the campaign was called Considering What, which is basically sort of challenging like those really patronising views that people sometimes hold about Paralympians, and in terms of, I guess, if you're watching a Paralympian compete and they've just broken a world record and someone's sitting there and saying, oh, that's really amazing considering ... So Channel 4 kind of set out this year to sort of challenge that perception, I guess, and that's probably the next evolution of it, in that when you have a broadcast or a sponsor that's been associated with the event for that long, they come to understand it a little bit more, and they come to feel a little bit more comfortable in the way that they talk about it. Because I don't know, with something like the Paralympics, maybe there is a sense as a business, there's sort of, you're worried about the eggshells that you might be treading on when you're talking about it. Whereas I think Channel 4 felt, given they've had this long running association with it now, it's like, okay, we have that authenticity to kind of really challenge some of those notions that people have about Paralympic athletes. And I think you saw that come across in that campaign, which was like, I think, a really good evolution of the Meet the Superhumans one. Yeah,
just sort of looking ahead, I mean, I'm thinking multiple Paralympic cycles ahead, but I just think the Paralympics going behind a paywall in major markets, again, just using the UK, I just think would be so detrimental for the Paralympic movement. Again, I know I might be quite a romantic take, but like, yes, aside from, you could look to things like the extra revenue that would bring and stuff like that, but the Paralympic movement feeds off exposure, because as well as, you know, obviously providing elite level sport, it's about things like challenging perceptions, changing perceptions. It's got, you know, multiple kind of KPIs that exist beyond just sporting success. And the benefits of aligning with public service broadcasters, you know, it was the BBC in the UK, now it's Channel 4. Public service broadcasters, large audiences and commercial returns are not the sole driving forces behind, you know, their kind of their program remit. And I think that feeds nicely into what the Paralympics is about as a movement as well. So I think they're personally a perfect match. And I just think if you immediately, particularly as, you know, it comes after the Olympics, and to avoid an Olympic hangover, if you like, it's easier for users to just not watch it. And if you're putting it on a platform which has a limited audience, where realistically the people are only going to be compelled to watch it, the people who paid, or people that really like the Paralympics, I think opening it up to a PSB is just, I think, so much more conducive for what the Paralympic movement is about and what its sort of future success is. But no.
I wasn't saying that the Paralympics should go on to
onto
a Discovery Plus. My point was more that I would like to see Channel 4 really go all out in terms of their presentation of it on their own streaming platform. Like, whether or not that's called All 4 in 4 years' time or whatever, that's fine. But like, yeah, just really look at what you can potentially do and look at the options that opens up. Because like you said, like, this is the first event where all 22 sports are being broadcast. Then take all 22 feeds and give them to the people. Like, if they're going on YouTube anyway, why not just bring them to your own platform, and then you can have that as something that you promote around too. Right. Paralympics, let's move on. I've got a few things here that I kind of want to roll into one. This was an announcement from ESPN that came out last week that they would be using generative AI to generate match reports around some of their smaller properties, or their less high-profile properties. Two that were picked out in that were the Premier Lacrosse League and the NWSL. Now, the NWSL would probably argue that it's probably deserves a bit more attention than just an AI-generated match report.
Especially given one of its broadcast partners is ESPN. Wonder how they feel about that.
Yeah. I mean, ESPN probably carefully worded that to say that it wasn't a smaller property. But essentially, ESPN's case is that they're expanding their coverage of this. And the NWSL, which this weekend hit at 1.5 million in attendance at record pace. What were your thoughts when you saw this story, gents? Ed, Sam, who wants to take it first?
I should say, like, ESPN, they have said that the recaps that we use to augment and not replace existing coverage. I guess some coverage is better than no coverage. I am sort of finding from, well, the friends and family that do still want to talk to me, they do often say, are you worried about AI in terms of your job? Because, you know, things like match reports, whatever. And like anything, AI, you know, without wanting to get into a huge deep dive into what AI is, you know, it's a tool that can, you know, help aid and support, you know, information gathering, stuff like that. I think perhaps what ESPN is maybe underestimating is that, particularly in things like print and digital media, written media, I should say, like, that audiences actually really value things like community and building an affiliation with particular writers and stuff like that. That obviously takes time and is often not the easiest thing to do, but I think that may be harder to do if you are producing something using artificial intelligence. But again, you know, ESPN's chairman Jimmy Pitara, like, he's made clear they plan to use generative AI to create personalized versions of their news show, SportsCenter, for example. So I think this bit that they're doing for the NWSL and the PLL, I think it's just going to be a drop in the ocean for their wider sort of AI plans, if you like. So I think this is pretty small fry compared to what they're going to be doing going forward.
I think the stuff it's being used for is all right. Like, they've said that there's going to be match recaps of NWSL games and lacrosse games, which, like, a match report is like a very linear thing, right? It's sort of like, here's what happens.
It's almost quite outdated at this point.
Yeah, like, I don't know. I'm sure people do. Tom, you might have some better insight into this. But I personally don't really read match reports anymore, especially because most of the matches that I'm interested in I've sort of watched, or if I want a recap of a match now, I'll probably go and watch the YouTube highlights package that's up like 5 minutes after the final whistle's blown, rather than necessarily reading about it. So if the purpose of this is to, make sure that they're providing coverage for those sports that maybe they felt like they weren't able to serve properly before, but it's also kind of freeing up their writers to tell like deeper stories about those same sports properties and like do deeper analysis, which I think is what people want now. Like, I think people are sort of chasing the why about things rather than necessarily the sort of the what. So if this kind of frees up their NWSL writers to go and do a deeper dive on Alex Morgan, for example, rather than have to just write the match recap, I think that's maybe like an efficient way of using it. Although interesting to note that apparently ESPN's recap of Alex Morgan's last game for the San Diego Wave at the weekend didn't actually mention Alex Morgan. So maybe there's some fine tuning in the process that needs to happen.
But they've been claiming that AI generated recaps are going to be reviewed by human editors to ensure quality. So maybe that was. Oops.
That's kind of my stance on it. I think if it is something like a match recap, which is very linear, and it frees them up to tell deeper stories about the NWSL, about the Premier Lacrosse League, whatever else it might be, then yeah, fair.
From a back-end perspective, like the thing about match reports in 2024, and this is super nerdy, but they are really great for SEO. So if you can kind of generate content which is really good for SEO without really putting much effort into it, and then you would be potentially a funnel for things like you mentioned, Ed, community building. So like on quite a lot of major sports publishers or national newspaper titles and stuff like that, it's often the case that the comment sections are really what people come for in match reports, is they come to talk about their team and interact with other people in that community, almost in the same way as like a fan forum. So if really that's all these kind of things are starting to serve, because as Sam said, like if you want the highlights or if you want a visual report, YouTube highlights are there. You can watch the goals on X usually within about 30 seconds of them happening, thanks to some wonderful unofficial partners in states with with less than decent privacy regulations. They kind of have a very different purpose to what the original idea of a match report, which was you would read about it the next day in the paper based on these almost mythical reporters who would go off and cover these fantastic events. And now it's like everyone can see it. It's pretty like there is no mystery anymore. And match reports almost serve a completely different purpose. So yeah, to your point, Seb, I think it's, for me, I have a similar view in that if it allows you to go and provide that deeper coverage, which this is what ESPN is saying, then that's fine. But you then have to deliver on the other side of it. To stay on the NWSL, and you mentioned Alex Morgan already. She's been a regular in our 50 most marketable lists ever since I joined the company and probably before. Obviously, she played her last game at the weekend. For me, the most interesting thing about this was the journey actually that the NWSL has been on in her career. So when she started, the NWSL was averaging, I think the attendance is around 4,000. Now the average NWSL attendance is around 11,000. 26,000 came to watch her farewell game, which was the second most popular San Diego Wave game and the third best attended NWSL game of the season. It's almost like her career is kind of a bit of a, I guess, like bookmarks almost, or marks along the path for the NWSL.
Yeah, definitely. And I think like what you can say about Alex Morgan is that like the fact that she has achieved those things, just the fact that she has become this kind of global star, she's done it at a time when like women's sport, women's football, the NWSL, I mean, there's not been much of a, as you mentioned, like she's been there from the start. It's not been around that long, the NWSL, but she's done all that at a time when there's not been much visibility at all for her and for women's sport more generally. So she's had to work really hard for that, and probably harder than like other people might have had to. And so I think that's like one thing that you can say about her, and like just the impact that she's had. I think obviously the NWSL has grown with her. The NWSL has needed those US women's national team stars to kind of get to where it is today. Obviously it's required other things also, but having the profile of someone like her to carry that has been really important. I think when it first launched, her team was the one with the highest attendance, so that sort of
Portland Thorns,
speaks to the star power that she had. But she's also just had like a really significant impacts in other areas as well. Obviously it's she's been a big part of that that equal pay drive that the US women's national team went on and eventually secured a few years ago. And yeah, now it sounds like on the back of her career, she's going to continue investing in women's sport. She said as much in her parting press conference. Yeah, you wouldn't be surprised to see her, I don't know, launching an NWSL expansion franchise at some point in the next few years, or joining the ownership group of another one that already exists. So yeah, I think you can say that for all she's achieved on the pitch, she's had a really big impact in kind of growing women's football, not just in the US but probably globally as well. I think.
Yeah, I think her impact now she's retired is going to extend beyond just football. I think wider women's sport is going to really feel the benefits of Alex Morgan. You know, she's got her own foundation, for example, and then she's an investor in Unrivaled, the new women's basketball 3-on-3 league. So she's clearly expanding her portfolio and influence beyond just the NWSL and indeed women's football in the US. So I think, I mean, it's probably not fantastical to say she could even have a bigger impact on wider women's sport now that she's retired, given her sort of the investment plays she's made so far.
They're all good points. I think my final thought on this is that it's sort of like that generation of players who you would almost consider just US women's national team players is phasing out in the NWSL. And soon I think players will become maybe more associated with the teams or the franchises that they play for. I think there was some sort of stat when Megan Rapinoe retired, she played more games for the US women's national team than she had for any single club, which you just wouldn't get that in the men's game. Whereas that might not be the case when the next Alex Morgan retires. You'd like to think that would be the case, because that would say that the women's club game is in a stronger place, and that the sport has switched from being almost converse to what we were talking about at the start of this with FIFA and UEFA, where the international game is way more important in the women's game than the club game. That shift could, by the time, say, Alyssa Thompson retires, who was drafted first by Angel City last year and is already breaking into the US team. And by the time she retires, she could be an Angel City legend rather than a US women's national team legend, and that maybe be a good thing. I think that's probably a decent place to wrap. Ed, Sam, thank you very much for your time.
Cheers, Tom. Cheers, mate.